Onto this conversation now. South Africa's decision to buy land for black farmers has not been well implemented. The purpose of land reform was to bring black farmers back into the mainstream agricultural economy. Now, most of the farmers that were given the land to farm have not achieved commercial status. Joining us now is Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Mr. Sihlobo, thank you very much for your time. The issue of land reform, this was an apex priority of the ANC government when it took over power in 1994. Can we locate how far this process has gone in your view?
Happy New Year, Tony, and to your viewers. Indeed, land reform was one of the important policies of the governing political party, and I believe it's still one of the important ones for many South Africans. Now, you go back to 1994 and you read the material that was coming out of the ANC. They were aiming that in a space of about 5 or so years, they would have been able to acquire about 30% of the land that would have previously been on white farmers and distribute it to new entrant black South African farmers and other households that needed the land. When we look back now and say what has happened over time from 1994 up until today, we see that that target has continuously been moved. But now the numbers we have, for example, on ourselves at AgBiz and with my colleagues at Stellenbosch University suggest that we are somewhere at around about 21% or so of that 30% target, which means that there has been some bit of progress, but of course not a desired progress if you think of it from a lens that in 1994, this was something that would have been done in 5 years' time or so.
Yeah, and I'm deliberately going into history so that once we come to the matters today, the viewer has a fuller picture of where we come from with this. In July 2003, the land acquisition program was approved in principle. The implementation began in 2006. Only 21% has been achieved. Is that a pass or a failure?
It's not a desired progress, Tolly. And for me, the policy itself or the program itself, that one, is not something that I would have supported. Because what it did, as it came online in 2006, it basically meant that all of the new entrant black farmers that were getting land from the state, they were not receiving it with title deeds or long-term tradable leases, which could have been used maybe as a collateral or so. Now, you go back to that period in 2003, at the start of this program, and it coming into effect in 2006, up until today, there's over 2 million hectares of land that the state has bought at that time. The question then that comes about is to say, in that roughly just over 2 million hectares of land, how much of it is actually fully productive? Is that land that was acquired used in a way that derives the economic benefit for those that are involved in the communities that are close by? And when we look at the studies that have been done in that effect, even the government studies themselves, they are not indicating something to celebrate. There's been some failures in as far as that is concerned. And I think the issue of capital, the issue of beneficiary selection that was not quite in an appropriate way, and the follow-up support to farmers that got the land, it's where the failures were largely on.
Yeah, and I like what you've just said, because acquiring land on behalf of black farmers who say, in principle, that they want to get into the farming space, that's one thing. But when they now have the land, at least the 21% that have been fortunate enough, then in comes the question of using the land productively. I remember the former president, Thabo Mbeki, lamenting the fact that black farmers, in some instances, simply want to take the land, but they don't want to work it. Instead, they may want to lease it so that they get financial benefit. Is that effectively where we are?
That challenge, Tony, comes about because there isn't proper work that might have been done over the past few years in selecting the right people that want to farm. Studies by folks like Professor Ruth Hall at the University of Western Cape, some by Professor Johan Kirsten at Stellenbosch and Nick Fink also at Stellenbosch, they do show this tendency that there was a sense that land coming from government was allocated to certain individuals, mainly male, black, some with some political linkages, and they have not been able to actually farm appropriately. And that has come at an expense of some of the black people who really wanted to farm, and young black people, young women that wanted to come into farming, which you see even in our days when you look at social media, see what people are doing in small plots of land. When the selection had to come, we were supposed to look back and say, who is really farming, and have some sort of a criteria, some sort of an incubation house, and make sure that you allocate the land to the correct people that will use it productively. And if you have done that and you follow it up through with the financial support, and you have an incubation period which assists people to learn certain skills that they might have been missing in the process, then I think we would have been able to see some good success. But that was a shortcoming in that program. And this is something that actually you will remember that in 2018, I was part of what was called the Presidential Land Expert Advisory to President Ramaphosa. And part of the recommendations we put forward to the president there was that we need to crystallize the beneficiary selection criteria of who gets to benefit on the land, particularly land redistribution. And that's something that I would say over the past year or two, we saw government putting in place, and I'm hoping that going forward, that's the mechanism that could actually be used to avoid these shortcomings that we saw over the past 2 decades.
And that is perhaps the solution here, Wandile Sihlobo, because what we are talking about now is a program that seeks to help these farmers, because it's easy to be cynical when you are not a farmer to say, well, you asked for the land, here it is. Why are you not working it? And I know that in some instances there has been some principle that says use it or lose it. So talk to us about the support that has either gone into these programs where a farmer has acquired land, but they need money, as you've just mentioned, but they also has got to be that period of incubation. Has government paid enough attention to that, or are they quick to criticize once they have allocated this land to the intended beneficiaries?
What we saw actually over the past few years is that the attempts from government were through what they call the recapitalization fund that they were putting out to some of the people that might have benefited on land reform. It had some successes in parts of the Northwest and amongst the grain farmers in large part, but I think it still didn't give us that new crop of black farmers that we wanted to see. And I say this clearly because if all of us as South Africans, we are honest and we look at the numbers, it is clear that out of the commercial agricultural output in South Africa, on average, black farmers are still making up roughly 10% of that. And when you look through history, go back to the 60s, it's not quite clear to us as academics if that number has actually changed. It's been flat on that. If anything, it has declined over time. Then the question is to say, how do you increase that new crop of commercial black farmers while at the same time ensuring that the existing white South African commercial farmers are also participating fully to support the food security and the foreign earnings that we get into from agriculture. And then that comes back to the point to say, going forward, let's have a proper support system. What I'm delighted with from Minister Didiza now, together with the Land Bank, they launched what they call the Blended Finance Scheme, which at the end of last year, which I think could be useful. But then to support that, we have to have a mechanism where land rights are transferred to the beneficiaries. You might have been reluctant to do that if you didn't select the right beneficiary. But if you go through a rigorous process and you put them through incubation period, then I think you should be able, when you have selected, to give them those land rights and collateral so that they can go to the land bank and go to other financial organizations to acquire funding, utilizing that as a collateral. And of course, offering them any other support that is needed. I think once we begin to see that, we will see some success. And in addition to that, we should never underestimate the fact that as South Africa, we have one of the most advanced commercial farming in the African continent, on par with some of the leaders in the world. Then that means that there is a skill set that is in the country. Then how do you manage to bring it into partnerships as you transfer the land and make sure that the know-how is transferred to the new entrant farmers, and we build it in that way? And I think what Minister Didiza is thinking about around the beneficiaries selection policy that I mentioned, blended finance instrument, and what they had talked about in the SONA last year, which they call Land Reform and Agricultural Development Agency. Those are some of the instruments, if they put them in place appropriately, that I think could be able to give us some bit of successes than the outcome of the past few years, which, if we are honest, is not really something to celebrate much.
A very, very educational conversation indeed, Mr. Sihlobo. Let's crystallize it before I let you go. So, did you just say that out of the 21% of black farmers that now have land in their hands, only 10% have achieved commercial status?
The point there, Tony, I'm putting forward is to say there's 21% of that land. Not all of it is with black farmers. Large part of that, I would say 60% or so, it's still in the government hands. That's, in our estimates, about 2.4 million hectares. Now, what's needed is for the government to progressively transfer that to the correct beneficiaries, which have gone through the rigorous process of selection and incubation period. Thereafter, give them the land rights. With those instruments in place and some partnerships that can come from private sector on transferring know-how and any other assistance, we think that that 10% number could begin to grow over the coming years. And that's backed up by also research that has been done by our friends at BFAP, the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, which have looked at this thing quite seriously, and they saw that we can achieve a lot by bringing that roughly 2.4 million hectares that is in the state hands now into production. And I think Minister Didiza has quite gotten that message from various interactions that I've seen her acknowledging some of these things.
Wandile Sihlobo is Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Thanks indeed for a very insightful conversation there.